Welcome to Roopa's Six Questions for Authors. It's a real pleasure to welcome Puja Guha to today's edition. Puja and I met because we're going to be together on a panel at BauschaCon later this year. Hi, Puja.
Roopa, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here and excited to be on the panel together in October.
Likewise, likewise. So, folks, Pooja is the author of the Amazon best-selling thriller series, The Ahriman Legacy, as well as suspense novels and dramas like Sirens of Memory and The Confluence. She also has a background in finance and in healthcare management. She's been in international development. She's worked and grown up and worked all over the world and channels all of that travel into her novels, seven of them so far. And what settings as varied as New York to Madagascar to Iran. She's been featured on TV, movies, Fox 5, Reader's Digest, the London Post. I am looking forward to her sharing her insights with us. I am Roopa Krishnan. By day, I'm a Chief Strategy and Innovation Officer. And now, by night, I am also the author of business books and crime fiction. I was inspired by the questions that I would get from audiences on my book tour about that sort of the bifurcation of my mind that must take place when I have to do both of these things. And I thought in many ways that's what all writers do. So that's the result. And this podcast, this show is all about exactly that. So now let me invite you, Pooja. Tell us a little bit about your books, first, your latest, all of the above.
Yeah, absolutely. So I primarily write a varied range of thrillers, all featuring a lot of international settings and kind of political and unusual dynamics that I've um, been able to experience with a little bit of a front row seat from growing up all over the world and working in many of these places. So living and working all over the place from the work in international development and my time growing up. So I'll show you a couple of my books. So we've got Ahriman 1. So the Ahriman Legacy, The Spirit of Destruction, which is book one of the series, which is how my journey really started. And then the most recent one in that series, which happens to be book five of the spy thriller series called Battle for the Veiled City. And it's really been quite a journey. I've gotten to go back to places that I spent a lot of time with in either my childhood or during my working life, places that aren't actually, in general, are often not easy to access. And so the series has really given me that opportunity to kind of be there again through my characters and show how those places have spoken to me over time, like a little bit of my characters falling in love with the setting the way I did.
Fabulous. And I'm looking forward to it. I've seen your books on my Amazon shelf for a bit. I'm planning to, try and get through my current backlog, and I think you'd be the great partner to my travels too. Given the broad geographic spectrum you've taken your characters through. So let's
Thank you.
get cracking. Let's get cracking. I have six questions, and I'll start with the very first one, and I think everyone's curious about it. Every writer has this first idea, the book that made them think, I have to write this. And that's in your case, Ahriman Legacy. What was your spark that actually the origin spark that got you going?
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in Kuwait, which is where a large chunk of the Spirit of Destruction is set. And you'll see on the cover, you have Kuwait Towers featured in the back. Um, and Kuwait has a sort of very interesting political dynamic. So in many ways, you could consider it one of the most democratic countries within the sort of Middle East Peninsula, the Arabian Peninsula, excuse me. They have a democratically elected parliament, and they do have a monarch, but the monarch is heavily bound to what parliament decides and dictates. And these two figures butt heads very, very frequently. But what happens in general, and parliament has two large factions. One is an increasingly conservative, very traditional Islamic faction, and the other is very liberal, really like pushed through by like modern youth, Kuwaiti youth, that kind of thing. And because the more conservative faction has grown larger and larger over time, and the actual monarchy tends to be reasonably progressive, they constantly are at odds. And so, what happens when they really can't get along and nothing can be decided is the emir, the monarch, fires parliament. And then 6 months or so later, parliament is reelected. But in that interim 6 months, the emir has managed to push through some type of legislation. And that can be really something very minor that they just couldn't agree on based on principle, or it could be something much more important. And I had been seeing that dynamic throughout my like years living in Kuwait. And I was visiting my parents on vacation from my first job when I was living in New York. And the emir fired parliament for like, I mean, the numbers at this point don't even matter. It was something like the 12th time in 8 years or something crazy along
Wow.
those lines.
Wow.
And it just occurred to me that why wouldn't um, someone from the most conservative faction in parliament hire an assassin to get rid of the emir? And it just became this idea for this book that I had to write. And once I started thinking about other things, the main characters just sort of popped up to me. And then once I actually sat down to write it, which took me a little bit of time to really get started, from there, the book just sort of happened. And I discovered in that process that this was not going to be just a one and done hobby endeavor, and that it would be something that I would continue for the rest of my life.
Fabulous. And it's sort of a gutsy thing to do to write about an assassination while while in a Middle Eastern country, but well done. And and you talk about taking you some time. My second question is, I call it the process ritual, right? Because there's this element of, actually what is sort of this idealized visual of somebody who puts on their writing jacket and sits down every day for 4 hours, etc. Maybe you've gotten there, but then there's the reality of many of us, right, where it's not that dramatic. What does your process ritual actually look like? How do you get your work done?
At this point, my process is pretty well defined, but it took so much trial and error to get here. So it covers kind of two different facets. One is the regular everyday. So I write or edit, depending where I am, with a particular piece of work 5 days a week. I usually write to a word count target, which has worked very well for me. And sometimes that target can be as high as 1,500 to 2,000 words a day. Sometimes that target, depending on what else is going on with my consulting business, travel, all that kind of stuff, that target can be more like 500 to 600 words. But either way, every day progress is being made, even though some days it feels like a lot of progress has been made, and some days it feels like barely anything has happened. And I try not to be too hard on myself for, the harder days anymore. That's still very much a work in progress, but that is a huge part of my process is just continuous time. I found that 5 days a week works really well for me, but definitely not prescriptive by any means. And the other piece, a little bit similar to what you've done going to Paris to finish your book, the most recent one that you've been working on, I take anywhere from 2 well, at least two in a year writing retreats, sometimes more depending on life and the length I'm able to be away from home for. And during that time, what I've done is usually a self-directed writing retreat. So sometimes I've gone with friends, sometimes I've gone by myself, but I usually just pick a place that I like,
Right,
often a place that my dog likes also, because she's a very important part of my writing retreat ritual.
right,
And we I wake up every day and write usually 3,000 to 4,000 words while I'm on retreat. Depending on the length, when I've done longer ones, it'll be 7 days a week, but I usually give myself a little bit of a leeway on that seventh day to write a little bit less and get a bit of a break. And then once I hit that target, I can do whatever I want for the rest of the day. Once in a while, I have to deal with some urgent emails or other work, but I try and front load that so I don't have to deal with it when I'm away. And then um, I usually try and spend like the rest of the day these days on the mountain with my dog. Yeah. So we get lots of great hikes in. Nature really inspires more thought, and then the next day begins again. And so during the retreats, I can make tons of progress,
right,
whether that's
right,
just, I mean, I've often finished books during retreats, but sometimes it's just that I've made a ton of progress and gotten
right.
through the tough parts of the middle. But either way, it's just something like you mentioned earlier, about getting away from laundry and dishes and like just normal everyday home stuff that just opens
Right.
up the word count and just you can just write.
Yeah, yeah. To my viewers, I'm currently in Paris. I decided to take 3 weeks and get away, and actually, the first week and a half was really productive. I had edits in from one of my beta readers for the sequel to Jasmine Murders, and it had been sitting with me for like a month and a half, and I just couldn't get my head around it. While, as you said, dishes were piling up, so I decided this was a way to do it. And, voila, it's done. And I just submitted it today. Very happy. So, um,
Congratulations.
but that's actually, it is the kind of investment that I think if you'd asked me 4 years ago, I never thought I'd do, like to put the time and effort and spend all of that, mental bandwidth to go away, right? It takes some effort to plan it, but it's so productive, like you said. I did not take my dog. I think that's an experiment I'll see for the next time.
International travel is a bit tricky
Yeah.
there.
Okay, question number three, the day job tension. So writing and your professional life exists in the same brain, right? What has writing given your career, and the other way around? I mean, I get a sense that you're, really using your lived experiences in your books, but say more.
I think they've definitely fed each other as I experimented and found a process that would work. I think initially the consulting work really took away from the time for writing until I figured out a process that I could continue that didn't just break whenever I was traveling or whenever deadlines came up.
Right,
Um, but writing definitely benefits, of course, like you said, from all of the places I've been able to see, all of the really odd and interesting human dynamics at meetings and government interactions, and
right,
just like personal, like finding a new cafe, whether that's in Paris or in Mali, like all of that kind of stuff has
right,
really fed and fueled inspiration for my books. Um, Even little things like colleagues requesting, like, hey, you need to write a book that's set here because we're doing this big, cool project here, has just helped. Sometimes inspiration is so extensive that it's hard to channel like which of these million potential ideas I want to actually focus on. And so that has, just been like a little bit of an extra benefit from those interactions and things like that.
Right.
And in terms of what my consulting career has definitely gained from my writing is one, it's just fun to talk about. It's a huge icebreaker with people that I meet. But also, I think that my growth as a writer has really enabled me to understand and perceive what's going on beneath the surface with people I'm interacting with,
Right. Right.
on the business side as well. So, there's so many things that like we might have a certain reaction and at first glance it seems like, oh, okay, it's because this deliverable is not quite what we expected or XYZ or something very, very simple, even like in what we say. But what's really going on is, oh, something else happened that may or may not have anything to do with it. And really delivering to a client is often about figuring out what's actually underneath the surface.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and
Right.
so I think everything from becoming more observant about people and how they behave and interact, but even things like looking at revisions, right? You might get a note from an editor that's like, okay, change XYZ, and it just doesn't resonate. But it's like, okay, what is the note behind that note?
Right.
What do I need to fix that will still solve this problem, even if it isn't the way that the editor maybe is expecting?
Right.
And that just thinking about stuff like that, I think, has really helped me on the business side.
Very cool. Yeah, and I do think that there's an element of empathizing with because you're playing out your characters in your head, and so you're putting you get into the habit of trying to see the world differently, right? And I think that's a key part of this. Very interesting. So question number four. What I call the abandoned idea, right? What are there any ideas, books, articles that you've started, maybe even gotten deep into researching perhaps, and then kind of walked away? And what does that say about you, your process, the idea? Say more there.
Yeah, I think so when I finished this book, which is the fifth in my spy series, I was a little bit torn. I knew that the series was going to change directions if it was going to continue. And I do have a vision for a sixth book that would be led by different lead characters who are introduced, but really kind of a little bit of a spin-off in a way, even though it would fall in that progression. I have plotted it out, even written a few scenes, but have chosen to focus elsewhere. And what does that say about me? I think right now, other ideas are captivating me much more. Right? So I have written the first book of two new series, and I wrote another standalone book that I actually just finished the first draft of, which it's going to need many revisions, but I finished the first draft last week. And so it's just, I think part of the process that I've learned is, I mean, discipline is so important, but there's also things you need to do to feed the creative beast or creative mind. And sometimes pushing through isn't necessarily the best thing. It's really hard to, because I think a lot of times you do need to push through. So it's a big
Yeah,
nuanced statement here.
right.
I think I will probably pick that book up again at some point. Probably in part because a big part of it was going to be set in Romania, and I'm really excited to write about that after I've been working there for a few years. But I don't know when that will be, and am not super worried about it at this point. Although when I decided that it wasn't quite moving the way I wanted it to, I decided to put it down. I felt a little bit guilty. But at this point, I think it falls under the like trying not to be too hard on myself and just allowing creative ears to drive the bus sometimes. uh, yeah, so that's one example. I do have a couple other spin-off ideas from the same series that may or may not become, my current pursuit at some point. I would expect they eventually will, but it'll happen when the time is right.
Very interesting. So not quite abandoned, more like shelved for now, kind of thing.
I think so. But I mean, maybe it'll turn out that they're abandoned. I don't need
You're
to
giving
figure it out
yourself
right
the
now.
grace to let it be.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, question number six is what I call the shelf test, right? So, I know that you have Amazon bestsellers, etc. But when you finish a book, do you have an internal sense of whether it's you've succeeded in what you've set out to do? What is your personal measure of success?
So at the end of a first draft, my personal measure is just being able to put the words the end. I think that it's just so fulfilling. There are definitely in almost every book, I have one exception. One of my standalones kind of I felt really, really solid about kind of every piece of the storyline. When I finished the first draft, which has never happened to me before that and will probably never happen again. Uh, I wrote in 5 weeks of writer's retreat, outline to ending. I'll
Amazing.
dream about having that back for probably the rest of my life. But in general, I think with every book, there's always like questions, particularly about the middle, about like keeping the movement of the plot going, keeping it really solid. Um, what points might be dragging. I think sometimes I also rewrite big action sequences much better in the second draft than in the first one. Not necessarily big, but just action sequences in general.
Right.
Um, and so I always really know that I'm going to have to put a lot of work in after that first draft. But the fact that it's finished is itself very successful.
Yeah, I like the idea, the end, that's your personal measure. Um,
Yeah, absolutely.
so my last question is kind of intentionally provocative, right? What I call it the necessary lie. Are there things you tell yourself? Because all writers sometimes do this, right? A belief in their process, their characters, their readers, that probably isn't entirely true, but it's sort of important for them to keep going. What's yours? Do you have one?
Yeah, I think your question was definitely very provocative. I really had to think about what that would be. I would say there's two answers that I landed on. One would be that you, and this is a belief that I came up with pretty early on when I thought discipline could just drive me through any difficulty in this process, is that, writer's block is completely fictional and that we can just find our way through all of it. And I think the answer to that is nuance. I think that by calling it writer's block, we often give it too much power. We shouldn't do that. I think discipline can push through a lot. But that doesn't mean you just keep, like, if it's really not working, you don't necessarily just keep doing the same thing. So a lot of times that can be adjusting your location, finding and that can be going to Paris on a trip, or that can be moving from your office to the living room, to the fireplace, to a cafe. Some adjustment is usually needed to help kind of get over these hurdles that we encounter. And it's not just discipline. And if you just try and focus on discipline, you burn out. And so I think that is a belief that I'm constantly sort of figuring out and reworking as I learn more about my own process. And that process happens to be different from book to book, which I never thought would be possible, but it is. The other piece, and I hope this is true, but I kind of need it to be true, so I'm just going to go with it, is that if I'm excited about writing something, I just am going to trust that my readership will find a way to be excited about it. Because there's all kinds of stuff, and people have done it, very successfully, and that's not a hit on them at all. That but about like writing to market in terms of like, oh, there's demand for this type of story or this type of plot, and I'm going to write it that way. Or even people even test ideas by click testing beforehand before they start writing. And I just know that that wouldn't work for me. So because I have to really feel passionate about an idea to
Yeah,
move it through. At least the basic crux of the idea. And then after that, the rest of it just happens. It appears. The
right.
characters drive the story, things about the outline change, all of that stuff. And so I really just hope that my readers are willing to go with me on that journey. So far, that at least has not proven incorrect, but it could change any time. And I do think people that write to market have been very successful. So there's obviously something to that as well, but it's just not something that would work for me. And
Right.
so I'm going to continue to believe that my readers will go with me.
No, and I think given the sort of the approach you've taken with your characters, you kind of have to go with what you know and what you believe in, right? So very nice. Well, listen, thank you so much. I find this so interesting. I think there's elements of the taking the time to go off on retreats, for example, that are really additive to the thinking that hopefully my viewers can learn from. I love that you've really used your lived experiences in such creative ways, and I think the fact that you're sort of found ways to expand beyond your core series, right? It takes some true effort, so kudos to you. So and
Thank you
see
so
you
much.
soon. See you soon at Baushakan.
Absolutely. I'm really excited about it.
Thank you. All right. Take care, Pooja.